Hi, everybody. Welcome to the 7th offering of our Scholars in the Square series. I'm pleased to see people here in person, on Zoom, and also in the future through YouTube. In our series, we have the speaker speak for 20 minutes. We have 20 minutes of conversation with an interlocutor. Our interlocutor today is Rita Tremblay from the Political Science Department. And then we have 20 minutes of conversation with the rest of people in the room. Our speaker today is Devyani, who is a graduate student fellow at the CSRS. She's also an assistant professor of legal practice at the Jindal Global Law School, Oakley Jindal Global University. Devyani is working on a PhD in the law program here at the University of Victoria. Before starting her doctoral program, she completed an LLM at the London School of Economics. Before that, she completed her BA and LLB at Nalsar University in Hyderabad, India. Devyani's research and teaching interests include feminist studies, disability rights, comparative constitutional law, gender and sexuality, and critical race theory. She also has an interest in Indian movies, and I think you're going to hear some of that tonight. Although her project is focused on India and legal issues, she is specifically attuned to the experience of minority communities struggling to find good ways to relate to the dominant society. And so this work draws our attention to larger questions that are consistent with our wish to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Osage peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And so please join me in welcoming Tewari.
So firstly, hello everyone, and I'm immensely grateful to the CSRS team, Paul, Rachel, Scott, Noriko for their support and for giving me this wonderful opportunity to present my work. I'm glad to be part of this vibrant, diverse CSRS community. They constantly introduce me to novel ideas which influence my thoughts, shape my research. Thank you so much to all of you to come here today, braving this cloudy, rainy weather, and listen to me. Thanks to the Zoom audience, especially those in India, where it's 6:30 a.m. right now. Thank you to my family, mentors, friends, allies sitting in different continents or listening to me virtually, despite getting little to no notice from me about this lecture, and my apologies to them. And let me begin this daunting task to describe my work in 20 minutes. So what is the story of my PhD project and my own project? So it probably, you're right, it does start with a big question. The big complicated question that my PhD project addresses is, do the gender-neutral marriage laws in India disproportionately affect women with invisible disabilities? If yes, what are the limits in these laws, if any? So how did this complicated question come into my mind? So the story started in 2018 when I first read about the marriage laws that I'm going to introduce you soon. And my first reaction when I read about these laws was one of shock. I was like, so what? Do these laws still exist? And this was at a stage in my professional life where I had already engaged with disability rights through my work as a lawyer, activist, researcher, and academic. So this week at CSRS, we discussed emotions. So I'll say that when I first saw and read these laws, I was shocked, not only as a human rights lawyer, but also in my personal capacity as a woman, Indian woman who practices Hinduism. And I decided to transform my shock into action. And I started thinking about questioning these laws, possibly suggesting reforms, and started this difficult journey of being a PhD scholar. Another issue which interested me and why I decided to take this PhD project was that at the global level, not just in India, but at the global level, there prevails pin-drop silence on disabled female sexuality, and only limited work has been done in this sphere, mainly by feminist social science researchers. So I hope that my work will remedy the shortcoming in the discourse on disabled female sexuality. So this talk today, we'll be focusing on the last two questions. How do Hinduism and Bollywood construct marriage and disability? how do individuals, especially women with disabilities, view marriage? Now, incorporation of Bollywood into my PhD project is pretty nascent, and this idea was born into my mind after a certain evening watching Jawan with Paul and imitating Shah Rukh Khan's signature step on the streets in downtown Victoria with him. And he's the better actor than me. And spending an evening discussing Shah Rukh Khan's cinematic journey. So I owe a special thank you to Paul for inspiring me. And for those who are who don't know about Shah Rukh Khan, he's also called SRK. He's one of India's biggest Bollywood superstars, and he has a big global fan base. So the context of this big question, where does this question lie? So there is no federal secular marriage law which applies to everyone in India, unlike the situation in Canada. So instead, there are distinct marriage laws which are applicable to an individual with respect to the religion that that person practices or is presumed to practice. So for example, Hindu Marriage Act governs marriages between Hindus, and the term Hindu in that specific statute includes Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs, and anyone who's not a Muslim, Zoroastrian, Christian, or Jew. So more than 70% of India's population identifies as Hindu, while the other statute that you see in the slide, the Special Marriage Act, that governs interfaith marriage. So for example, marriage between a Muslim and a Hindu. Now, according to Section 5(2)(b) of the Hindu Marriage Act and Section 4(b)(2) of the Special Marriage Act, marriage with a person having a mental disorder of such a kind or to such an extent as to be unfit for marriage and the procreation of children is voidable at the wishes of the other party. Section 13, subsection 1, subclause 3 of the Hindu Marriage Act and Section 27, subsection 1, subclause E of the Special Marriage Act state that if a party to the marriage develops a mental disorder during marriage, the other party can seek divorce. Now, the term mental disorder bears an identical definition in both these statutes, and it has been defined in a very vague, overbroad manner to include any disorder or disability of mind. So these two provisions, that's mental disorder being the ground for divorce and annulment, are present only in these two statutes. So this is why my PhD project scope is restricted to these two laws. Now, as we look at these laws, we need to remember that laws cannot be separated from the social, religious, cultural, economic factors and social constructs which are part of any society. So for example, in India, where disability, especially psychosocial disability, is extremely stigmatized, and most marriages in India are still arranged, I thought to myself, in this kind of socio-legal context, how do people with invisible disabilities, especially women with invisible disabilities, perceive marriage? So in this lecture, I'll be focusing on the Hindu marriage law and how Hinduism constructs marriage and disability. I'll not be looking at the Special Marriage Act in this lecture. Ooh. So when you go on a trip, on a big journey, like a PhD journey, metaphorically speaking, you pack suitable apparel, right? So for me, my suitable apparel was my research approaches, a combination of doctrinal and empirical. So when I did my doctrinal approach, I examined case laws in India, and I found that law does disproportionately affect women with invisible disabilities because most of the divorce and annulment petitions are filed by men against their wives. In my through my empirical approach, I employed surveys as well as qualitative interviews. My surveys were in Hindi as well as in English, and they had 65 participants in total. I interviewed 12 experts who happened to be academics, family lawyers, and researchers affiliated to disability, gender, non-governmental organizations. I also interviewed 5 women with invisible disabilities, and I'll be discussing my findings with you. So the big question for today, how do Hindu law, Hinduism, and Bollywood construct marriage? So according to uncodified Hindu law, marriage is a sacrament, meaning that it's a holy union for the purpose of fulfilling religious duties. It's not a contract. And marriage creates an unbreakable bond between the spouses. Therefore, divorce is completely foreign to. The most important source of uncodified Hindu law are the Smritis. So the word literally means that which was remembered, and the Smritis contain the recollections given by sages and principles laid down by God. In Hinduism, marriage is also considered a sanskar or rite of passage and a bond for 7 lives. Now, interestingly, the Hindu law, which was uncodified earlier, it was codified in 1955 by the Nehru government, and Hindu Marriage Act was formulated. It's the codified law. It introduced the concepts of annulment and divorce, but in 1955, divorce was restricted to false grounds of divorce, like adultery, cruelty, desertion, mental disorder. But since the introduction of the provision of divorce on the ground of mutual consent, the Indian judiciary has oft observed that it's in a dilemma whether Hindu marriage is a sacrament or a contract. Now, ultimately, my explorations of the big question led me into Shah Rukh Khan's arms, speaking metaphorically as his signature step. So there's a saying in India that there are 2 unifying religions in India, Bollywood and cricket. So what I decided to do was, I decided to bat for Team Bollywood, and I thought about the linkage between Bollywood, marriage, and disability. So the movie poster we see here is that of the movie Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, which in English means a certain feeling happens. So Shah Rukh Khan portrays the character of Rahul, a confused Hindu young man, and he clings to one rule, captured in his iconic dialogue, "हम एक बार जीते हैं, एक बार मरते हैं, प्यार भी एक बार होता है, शादी भी एक बार होती है." So it means in English, we live once, we die once, we love once, we marry once. So this philosophy that he espouses is very similar to the Hindu sacramental nature of marriage. And he espouses this philosophy long after his wife has died. Despite Hinduism and ancient uncodified Hindu law allowing men to remarry. So in my view, there's a slight Hindu undertone to this movie, like many other Bollywood movies, that you're bonded in spirit to your spouse for 7 lives. Spoiler alert, or rather, I'm giving you the spoiler. The movie ends with him falling in love once again and remarrying. So he does break his rule. So the question arises, do Hindus still consider marriage a sacrament? Now, borrowing from Matt Orr's delightful coffee talk on the different sacred sites that this public lecture explores, I thought of marriage being a sacred site to the Hindu public. So the photo that you see here is that of my survey findings, where I asked individuals about their view on marriage. So almost 33% of my English-speaking survey participants consider it as a religious duty, and so does half of my Hindi-speaking survey participants. But none of my Hindu identifying interviewees consider marriage as a sacred site. In fact, one of them, Shalini, name change, of course, for anonymity purposes, she's Hindu and she's a woman with invisible disability, says, "Until I experienced marriage and thereafter divorce, my beliefs about marriage was subconsciously formed by religion and social beliefs. Like it's a sacred religious institution. There are gender roles and that a man must maintain his wife. Divorce is justified only if there's a gross fault, which is almost impossible to prove, etc." Interestingly, I interviewed only one Gen Z woman who also happens to be the only Christian woman in my case study. And she considered marriage as a union, to use the word union, soul connection, and a sacrament. But all my interviewees were unanimous in their belief that Bollywood's portrayal of marriage is very patriarchal. So, how do Bollywood and Hinduism construct disability? Now, historically in Bollywood, persons with disabilities were either depicted as subjects of ridicule or psychopathic villains. But I feel that the advent of Shah Rukh Khan challenged this binary. He's played the largest number of disabled characters than anyone in mainstream Bollywood cinema. And as while playing them, he's been the hero, anti-hero, as well as a humanized villain. So the photo you see here is a poster of a movie, My Name is Khan, where he plays an autistic man. One of my interviewees, Ria, woman with invisible disability, says, disabled are not considered important enough because we don't like to see disabled people around us. With respect to Bollywood's portrayal of disability, she says disabled are invisibilized. And even when we see disabled people, that's shown in a very disrespectful way. In Hinduism, disability is considered a flaw, and various understandings of disability prevail. Some people try to make sense of their disability by considering it as retribution for past life sins. Sometimes disabled are portrayed as malicious characters in Hindu mythology, like Shurpanakha in Ramayana. Now, disability is sometimes understood in Hinduism as eternal dependency, and that's harmful because it emphasizes the charity or pity model, which is visible in public attitude towards persons with disabilities. And I saw that in the answers of some of my survey participants. And this charity model also underpins government policies. And this perception of disability results in negative attitudes and stereotypes about disabled women not being suitable wives, mothers, which has far-reaching ramifications for them in the marriage market. Moving to my last slide, and many of you may recognize the photos here, Indian matchmaking. Very many people have binge-watched it, and Shah Rukh Khan and Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge with the signature step that Paul very well imitated. So, importance and relevance of marriage as an institution in India. Most survey participants feel that marriage will remain relevant for future generations, but few of them, and two of my interviewees, have questioned the relevance of marriage in India. In my findings, I discovered that my interviewees, that's women with disabilities, overlook love in their conception of marriage. So maybe I was a foolish, idealistic romantic when I started my fieldwork, but as celebrated anthropologist Helen Fisher says, we live for love, we fight for love, we die for love, we write sonnets about love, and our brain is wired for love. So what I would add to her fabulous words is, we pay for love, sometimes exorbitant amounts of money, like in Indian matchmaking. Hindu epics celebrate love. Shah Rukh Khan dances for love, sings for love, makes us cry through his monologues on love. So why do they overlook love? So Shalini answered my question by saying, growing up, I didn't see any marriage around me where love was predominant. And I ponder over whether there will be a happy ending for Vasudha, who says, another woman with invisible disability, I will never find the kind of marriage that I'm looking for in India because of its unique socio-cultural context. So I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, but an introspective one. How do you view marriage? That's a question for you. And towards the end of the session, we can perhaps take the last 2 minutes to listen to each other's reflections on this question. Thank you so much. And I'm following one of John Nelson's many invaluable suggestions. There's a sheet of paper kept before you to give anonymous feedbacks on my presentations, which I would really appreciate. And the Zoom audience could hopefully email me their feedback. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks very much, Devyani. That was wonderful, as I knew it would be. So if you just scoot your chair a little bit this way, and we can create a more intimate coffee table type conversation. So thanks very much. Now we have Rita Tremblay from Political Science and former fellow of the center and former vice president of the university and good friend of many of us. So you get to ask the first question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Devyani. It was fantastic, rich presentation. And I'm absolutely thrilled to see your project because you know the disability studies as an academic enterprise in India is only 10 or 12 years old. So you are really the pathbreaker. You're a pioneer, and I just love the Bollywood stuff in it, and so that's a bonus. So no, it's really, really great. So I think when I was listening to you, I was beginning to think about my growing up. Okay, so we are many generations away, and I still remember my grandmother telling me some stories. And Catherine, you might correct me because they might be completely wrong. And one of the stories she used to tell us about karma and disability was from Ramayana. You know, funny thing is Diwali is coming and Ram is coming back from exile for Diwali. This was about that how Ram gets into exile is because of so you know Ram's father, king, Dashrath had 3 wives and is the second wife who really cashes in on 2 promises. And one of the promises to send Ram to exile so that he wouldn't be the king for 14 years. But it is her hunchback maid, Maitri, and Mithra, who actually convinces Kakai to cash in that promise. And so because of her, and she's considered evil and just really, and then it's really funny that she really repents. So she goes to Ram and she says to Ram, I'm sorry I did this now that you have to go to exile. He said, don't worry about it. You know, you have done a good karma. And so in your next birth, you will be born as you will have another hunch, but Lord Krishna will relieve you from this cycle of birth and rebirth and deformity. And so I think I just was struck by the story that in our social construction of disability in our Hinduism is so much connected to karma. So maybe you could speak about that. And the other story, which I tell you, which I'm not sure, I cannot vouch for it, is when Lord Vishnu wants to marry Lakshmi. That's Lakshmi's elder sister has deformity. And her name is Alakshmi.
Lakshmi.
Yeah. And so because the younger sister cannot marry without the elder sister getting married. So he basically tells, I'm not getting married to the elder one because disability means that she will not go to heaven or I will not go to heaven. So she gets married to a tree. And as a result, then he gets married to Lakshmi. So how much the social construction, a religious construction of disability has an effect, particularly in terms of laws, which are now much more prone to taking care of disability.
I think the common man in India, at least that's what I found through my interviews and practice as a lawyer, I don't think they're aware of the fact that such provisions in matrimonial laws exist. Rather, it dictates their marriage choices, such cultural notions that you spoke so eloquently about. It dictates their marriage choices. And it dictates their perception, attitude towards persons with disabilities. And I think that's why the fact that disabled women are considered undesirable, unable to fulfill the so-called beauty myth, ideal of beauty myth, perpetuates, and it's there in Western society as well. But in Indian society, it's also because of the cultural notions of how a woman should look like, as well as what should the woman's role be. So many of these characters that you talk about, they're not shown in a very domesticated, nurturing, caregiver light. And unfortunately, that continues to be the stereotype that dominates minds of people when they're looking for a wife, because most marriages in India are still arranged.
Yeah, it's very interesting because what you say is also reminds me of a couple of the terms which are used to describe somebody who's disabled. I think one of the word is ashrit, so somebody who's dependent. So somebody who's really in a Hindu household is saying, "Oh, this woman is ashrit." So in other words, the charity we have to take care of it. But the second word which is used, which is really very interesting, and I've seen it lot of women who have particularly invisible disability is Dukyari. She is to be pitied.
Yeah.
She is um, one way to describe Dukyari, pitied, or she's sad, she's unhappy, and so we must need to take care of her. So it's a very kind of contradictory kind of understanding of disability, even in social milieu.
So Anita Ghai, in her empirical and many of her ethnographic studies, what she did was she quoted a woman who gave birth to a disabled daughter, like her daughter is around 20 years old, the disabled daughter, and the mother of this disabled daughter says, एक तो हम गरीब हैं, ऊपर से ये अपाहिज है. So in English, it means, firstly, we are extremely poor, and secondly, our daughter is disabled. So her basic problem is, what do I do with this daughter of mine? I cannot keep feeding her my entire life, and we don't have enough dowry to marry her off as well. So we have dual burdens as well. So yes, I think traditional, like women are seen as burden, and the fact that you are disabled makes you more. And then the social, another social marker is class. And when you're poor, then it's even more difficult, because I think in CSRS, as I've like maintained, like most of India is in survival mode. Like when the first thing is you have to feed yourself, you don't even think about disability rights per se.
Yeah, you know, as you talk, I keep on thinking about my own life and the people I know. Funny thing is there's such a difference between disabled men versus disabled women, right?
Yeah.
I've heard so many family friends and others who I know who have disabled sons. The solution for them is get them married.
Yeah.
Right? Let's find him a bride, and it's through sex, nurturing, that he'll somehow get better. Right?
Yeah.
And so that's a kind of a magical solution. And I've seen lots of them do that and then get into trouble later on because the guy's not getting better. But with regard to women, it's absolutely, women is completely discarded.
Yeah.
So if she's disabled, she's either they get her married at a much earlier age so that nobody discovers that she's disabled, or if she gets older, then she's sent to do all sorts of domestic stuff. So she becomes equal to a domestic servant. So I just found that the differences between the attitudes towards a disabled son versus a disabled daughter was very different in India. Or is it still the same?
So Renu Adlakha, I think in 90s, she did her study in Delhi, and she found that she's a sociologist. She found that it was very easy. It was easier for disabled men to find to get married to even non-disabled women, and or to find like any intimate partner or wives, while it's much harder, which is why during that time most of the disabled women were either unmarried, divorced, separated. But now the urban millennial women who are well educated, earning really, so these are like very class privileged women. Now they are in a position when they can say no to a marriage offer. And I learned from some of the people whom I interviewed that it's actually getting harder for men with learning disabilities. They could be earning really well, neurodivergent men in IT, bank, finance sector, but still they're finding it a hard time to find a suitable partner. But in rural areas, nobody cares because the conditions in many arranged marriages are that the boy should earn well, while the woman should be beautiful, able to procreate, and do the domestic chores.
Yeah, wonderful. So just continuing with that context, and the disabled woman generally is seen desexualized.
Mhm.
Okay, she's not able, she's not capable of marriage, she can't produce. But at the same time, we know that the number of suicides of disabled women are quite high. Some I don't remember. I remember reading somewhere that is higher than the farmers' suicides. Actually,
Oh, okay.
don't have the source.
And
But-
higher than men?
Higher than men.
Hmm.
Yeah. Although statistically we know that there's I think 11.1 out of 1,000 women commit suicide as opposed to 5.1. But it's basically farmers. Farmers. Where was I going? I'm just trying. But so on the one hand they are desexualized, but on the other hand they are the ones also much prone to rape.
Mhm.
So there's a huge incidence of raping of disabled women. And I remember a case about a few years ago in West Bengal, a 19-year-old young girl was consistently raped by her neighbor.
Mhm.
And then she gets pregnant, but she doesn't even know that she's pregnant. And it's after 6 months, the mother realizes that she's pregnant. And she has absolutely, there was absolutely no access to the judicial system. The police were very insensitive. Even in the court system, the judge kept on asking her questions and she couldn't understand. I think the case is still going on
Oh.
because they are asking for compensation because the mother is the one taking care of the baby and the daughter. So my question is, so this country, how does the law, gender neutral law, how does it resolve these contradictions of desexualization, at the same time rape, inability to provide access, legal access, and police
So although
security?
I'm assuming that the woman you're talking here has intellectual
Disability,
disability.
yeah.
Okay, so all the intellectual disability, so when I'm using the word invisible disability, how Indian courts have gone about it is they have usually linked psychosocial disabilities and neurodivergence and epilepsy. Epilepsy has become lesser now. It was earlier more. They've connected that to mental disorder. Which is why I decided to exclude intellectual disability from the scope of my project because there weren't
Okay.
enough judicial decisions on it. But on the when you're speaking about this woman who is intellectually disabled and she got raped. So there was this case, Suchitra Srivastav versus Chandigarh administration, and this case was on reproductive rights. And this woman also had intellectual disability. And so we don't know whether she got raped or whether it was consensual sex, but so she had moderate mental retardation, medically speaking, although of course I don't use this term. But the judges, the law enforcement machinery, and the people running that hospital, rather it was an institution for persons with intellectual disabilities, they didn't even consider that it could be consensual sex because because a woman with a disability, any disability, is considered asexual. So they didn't even think of the possibility. The first thing they came was, oh, it has to be rape because this woman couldn't have consensually desired sex. And then she wanted to be a mother. So she decided to keep the baby, but the Union Territory of Chandigarh and the state of Punjab and Haryana, they decided, no, we are going to abort the baby. So she went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court granted her the right to keep her baby. So it's a bit different to yours, but yes, you're right. Even in these cases, especially in lower courts, we see very gendered and ableist perceptions that judges, lawyers employ when they argue. They generally call a woman who's filing her annulment or divorce petitions as pagal. Pagal in Hindi means mad or insane. So the language that's employed, and through my interviews also, I found out that it was unanimous that at least in the lower court, the language used is very ableist. But even in the high court, I think it was Aurangabad High Court that said that a woman shouldn't complain, shouldn't use the word maid to describe herself because it's the duty of the woman to do the household chores.
She's the,
And this is
what do they call it? Ardhangini.
Ardhangini.
She's the half
Yeah.
part of the man. So how could she complain? But so when you're talking about it, can you talk a little bit about how divorce comes about under Hindu marriage law? I think there are very specific conditions
Yeah.
that you have.
So the fault grounds of divorce is cruelty, adultery, desertion, person has ceased to be a Hindu, mental disorder, and then there's the mutual consent for marriage. And then common law has said that there should be, and Law Commission of India has also suggested that we incorporate irretrievable breakdown of marriage, but that hasn't yet happened. So,
But there are conditions, I'm trying to see, I'm not that well versed with the Hindu marriage law, but there are conditions that when the marriage can be considered null and void. So for example, if a girl got married, if there was a marriage without.
That's void.
That's, yeah, null and void.
I thought
yeah.
divorce. So
Yeah,
null,
no.
Null and void is if a person is insane, that is null and void. If a person is committing bigamy, that's null and void. Interestingly, and I find this very interesting because we have a Child Marriage Restraint Act, but the ages, that's 18, 21, if that's not followed, there's nothing written about it being null and void.
So do men then leave women just saying that when they got married, they were not of sound mind? And so therefore.
So till now, no man has, so for example, if I were a man and I married a woman and I said, and this woman I later on found out that she did have some sort of disability, psychosocial disability, let's say, I could file a case of annulment also because this fact was not disclosed to me, so it's fraud.
Yeah.
But even if it was disclosed to me, I could still file an annulment petition. And annulment is worse than divorce because annulment means no marriage at all. So you don't get any alimony or anything. While in divorce, you still get some maintenance and support.
So do men take advantage of that?
Of course. Yes. And it's very easy to forge a certificate saying that she has this.
Yeah. When you talk about Bollywood, my movie was My Name is Khan.
Yeah. Rita mentioned that this interest in disability studies is about 15 years old.
About 10, 12 years old. I think the first departments came about it at GNU probably, about 2010, 28.
That leads me to wonder about the difference from a legal perspective in the way the law treats disabilities, like that you were talking about hunchbacks or whatever, or from an accident or something like that, versus the invisible ones. Because I haven't quite heard the definition of that category, invisible disability. I wonder if you could flesh it out a little bit and then talk about how the law treats it differently than visible disabilities.
So invisible disabilities, for the purposes of of course, invisible disability also includes cardiac issues, diabetes, but they won't be connected to mental disorder by the court. So for my project, I used neurodivergence, psychosocial disabilities, developmental disabilities like epilepsy. So for the purposes of my project.
But Paul's question is very good because most of the disability literature I know has not been able to distinguish between physical
Yeah.
and visible versus invisible disability.
Mhm.
And quite a bit, and I think part of the problem was because this whole area, when it came about, under was being studied by medical professionals, the
Mhm.
psychologists, and social scientists were not at all involved.
Mhm.
And it's only social scientists only recently have begun to look at the social construction. And so for
Yeah.
them, it was mental. So what they would do it mental disorder.
Mhm.
And so it's most of the studies were about mental disorder.
Yeah, that's why I wondered
yeah.
when you were saying 15 years ago, I was thinking what was happening in the medical arena or in the social scientific arena 15 years ago that would turn the attention to this question.
I think globally, disability rights movement is one of the newest movements because all of the people in this room are intelligent and very wise and learned, and they know that, like, for example, the feminist movement has been on since such a long time. But I believe that even the feminist movement overlooked the interests of disabled women because in many parts of the world, a person with disability couldn't travel to, let's say, an assembly or a protest to make their needs heard. And even the UN paid attention to rights of persons with disabilities only lately with UNCRPK. I think it's
Yeah,
2006.
I think what disability studies, disability whole as a discourse has been a very, very new one in India.
Yeah.
So what you have had is disability, at least from the policy perspective, which I know better, was under what so-called welfare measures.
Yeah.
Oh.
So these people need to be taken care of. And then from there, from welfare, it went into under developmental studies. So these people need to be developed. So the whole charity model was part of it. And even the law, which you'll remind, which is the
Yeah,
1995,
Earlier it was 1995.
it
Now
basically
it's the
talks about
2016.
lunacy. Okay, lunacy and insanity. And there is, I mean, it's unbelievable, the words which we would not associate with at this time. So that was it. It's only with the UN Convention 2006
I think, yeah.
that when the UN Convention was passed on disability and disability rights and how there's a social construction, a cultural construction, and we need to look at a much broader perspective, that India goes and changes its law. And that's in actually it takes 8 or 10 years to pass the law. And it's in 2016 the law is passed. So it's all very, very new.
So this is a good opportunity to kind of pivot to the broader conversation. So thanks very much. So we'll now move to a broader community discussion with the Zoom people too. So I think Rachel's probably giving you instructions on Zoom about how to pose questions that way, and she'll kind of articulate your question for you. But I think there are questions in the room too. So let's go to the page.
I'm wondering, just for starters, if Paul, you could demonstrate those dance steps.
No.
Okay, so I'll move on to another question. So some of the questions I had, Devyani, you answered in terms of, you would still get some alimony, even if it's because of mental disorder. And so does that, because you would still sort of have some financial responsibility, does separation that is a result of mental disorder, are more people sort of relying on annulments to get out of that?
Yeah.
And then what is the sort of gender balance? Is it more men that are seeking divorce or annulment because of their wife's depression or whatever it is than women seeking the same?
So in all the cases that I looked at, it was all the cases, it was men except for one, and you're very right. They of course seek annulment because they don't have to pay maintenance or alimony or anything. And when the woman is combating these petitions, sometimes she's kicked out of the matrimonial home. She's subjected to cruelty, domestic violence, dowry sought out, and all these are criminal offenses. But still, this happens. Only in one case I found that the woman sought divorce, but that was because the husband and her mother-in-law were actually subjecting this woman to cruelty. They had already told her to leave the matrimonial home, and they had been separated for 13 years. So there was like no hope
And do you have any sense of how often those claims are fraudulent?
So the individuals that I interviewed, the experts, they said that it's many of the claims are fraudulent. So to use the words of one of my experts, it was that when a woman commits a deviant act, now deviance could be something like not cooking dinner because she's sick.
Same.
So,
Yeah. Note to self.
Be a deviant. And when a woman, and if she does, or if she's reluctant to do any household chores, or if she raises her voice in an argument, then men, to get out of such an inconvenient marriage, they'll seek a better partner and they will make use of these, they'll go to a lawyer, do their research, make use of these provisions and get themselves out of such marriages.
Peter.
Thanks, Devyani. Here with the medical model of mental health, I wonder about the role of psychology and psychiatry in India. If a woman is accused of having a psychosocial disability, can she find another opinion? Are there enough psychologists and psychiatrists who can come up with an opinion that says, no, she's not disabled?
So many of the cases, the women did go and sought out another psychiatrist opinion and presented as an expert testimony. But the thing is, the very fact is, of course, like you're right, I mean, a person can go, but the amount of financial resources it takes, the amount of time, the amount of privileged position you have to be in to get all this information is you have to, and the amount of time it takes. And
She's
just
not cooking.
Yeah.
That was sarcastic.
Saving a lot of time.
Sorry. Rachel,
Yeah.
on Zoom.
There's a question from Francois, and Francois is asking, does marriage still represent the only possible future of adult life for Indian women, disabled or not?
Oh, that's interesting. So many, and great question. So many women, like some of my interviewees, two of my interviewees at least, resist the institution of marriage, and both of them happen to be millennial class privileged women as well. So but in rural areas and many women who are not economically independent, marriage is also considered a source of economic security and socioeconomic mobility. So for them, it is their future.
But things are beginning to change because in Bollywood, the actresses now are what they call it live-in relationships. This is something very, very new. So instead of getting married, they are living together. So I don't know, that urban lifestyle is changing.
So as you said, Bollywood actors, the Bollywood actors are very elite as well, and they have the privilege to break norms as well. So yes, one of my interviewees is cohabiting with her partner in a metropolitan city, and she's a divorcee. And but again, she's class privileged, economically independent, not dependent on her parents at all. And then the other interviewee, again, millennial class privileged, she and her partner is a foreigner, not Indian, and her parents were very accepting of this sort of framework. But does that reflect the reality of all Indian women? I don't think so, especially not the ones who are economically.
Megan.
Maybe I'm just misunderstanding, so it might be just clarification. When you talk about psychosocial or mental disabilities, like I'm seeing mental health like anxiety, depression, OCD, ADHD, like where does that fit in, and does that count as disability in the context of your work?
Yeah, so I did borrow the CDC definition, and it did have anxiety, depression, bipolar, and all within the ambit. So yeah, but thanks for asking. And the courts have linked it to mental disorder in the judgment.
There's actually one in the back. Yeah.
I think you had it first up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see.
Yeah, either way, I have so many questions, but I will try to keep it small. When you did your research specifically for this project, do you only speak to women within India, or do you speak to diaspora?
No,
As well.
only in India.
Okay, and then that would also fit into how much of a difference did you find in terms of by status, or in cases of Hindu marriage rather than Christian or Sikh marriage, how much caste played into how, like, the percentage of these, which levels had the highest percentage of putting in for these kinds of divorces? Like, I'm thinking in terms of elite classes here. It's sort of, there's been a shift in the last maybe 15 years where it went from being, and especially in like higher income elite class homes, where it went from being like, oh, the eccentric aunt, or like people trying to really kind of tamper down any sort of notions of mental instability, to a kind of, in some places it's almost more niche now. So like it would reflect kind of how much mental disability is either hidden or not by class, I guess.
That's actually a very good question. So, except for the Gen Z woman, who's also a Christian, she's the only one who's not as class privileged as the other 4 women that I actually, even one of them was not as class privileged. But like when the class privileged women who got divorced, they were class privileged, yet they did get divorced, and it was not tampered down for them. It was unfortunately said that a woman's role. So one of my interviewees quoted her father-in-law saying that a woman, and she was struggling with anxiety and depression at that time, but her father-in-law said that a woman's role should always keep smiling, being happy, so that she keeps the household happy. But I did ask my experts, when it comes to caste, class, how does it matter? And many of them were reluctant to comment on the lower class. Some did say that in lower classes, many of them cannot afford litigation, who are not class privileged. So it's just abandonment. People just leave each other and go away. And it's upper class and middle classes where divorce is a problem. It's a stigma, as well as it's the economic, where marriage becomes an economic institution, because there are no specific laws that this much amount of alimony will be paid or this much amount of maintenance. So when marriage has that economic implications, how many are reluctant to leave their partner, which is also why many women fight these divorce petitions as well, so as to sustain their position.
Thank you. This is really awesome work. I'm very excited to be seeing your research. I'm curious about this one of the last points that you made, where you were talking about how these 5 interviewees that you had, these women with disabilities, perceived marriage as being without love. And then I was also struck by the this role of this person with a disability as asexual that you mentioned. I'm wondering if this is almost a moment in which we see the law kind of like impinging on like self-conception here, where if I'm an asexual being, I'm almost an object, and hence how could the question even be that I could love, right? Or is there something else at play? Is this a moment in which these women are not so much taking on this narrative from the law as a more like kind of cultural narrative, or from Bollywood? I'm wondering if you kind of trace, if possible, where this sense that love is maybe impossible, or where that might come from.
So one of my interviewees who was married, she's divorced now, and she said that she never expected to find love as well, because she always thought, because of the construct of disability and how it prevails in the Hindu society, she always considered she had low self-worth, and she never thought she would get married in her life because she had a disability. So she never thought someone would love her. And one of my interviewees who became disabled during her marriage, before she wasn't, but now she's in her 50s. So she does say like when I went back to her and she said, the omission wasn't conscious, it will remain. But one of my experts said that the laws that they have formulated, the marriage laws, it's so hard for persons with disabilities now. They have no choice but to, like one of my experts said, it feels like they have no choice but to be asexual, although I may disagree with it a bit.
Is there much of a movement among Indian lawyers and judges and activists to alter these rules, these
No.
laws?
There is no.
Beyond
movement,
you?
unfortunately. Yeah, I'm the only one.
Wow.
I know that.
I mean, because I mean, given the size of the country, it's fascinating to me that there's not at least some lobby or some community that would be pushing for this, because it seems from the outside, it seems quite the system is pretty rigged.
Yeah, and like the point Rita made about disability being just disability, no distinction between physical visible disabilities and invisible disabilities. I think there is no strong movement. Like I never saw anybody question this personally, like no scholar has addressed these questions.
Catherine.
I'm struck by one thing, and that is if we look at the Hindu position of marriage in its traditional Dharmashastric sense, there was no divorce. Now, with modern law, there is divorce. So where were disabled women better off? And if you think of that traditional family context, one interesting analogy, I think, is with widowhood, or if widowhood is combined then with Alzheimer's of some kind, that's a disability. But there are different disabilities, or they change perhaps depending on age. But what I've often noticed, and maybe it's just my casual outsider's eye, is that there are lots of people in these extended families that are taken care of. So we always have to think where the abuse is, and it's certainly there, but there's also all kinds of accommodation. And I've often thought, because unlike cold climates, people can move about, and in villages move around, that there is a social context. And I've often found people quite gentle with people with disabilities. So I don't know how one would ever create a statistical profile for this sort of thing, because of course, when it gets into into divorce discussions and court cases and so forth, you hear about the extremes. But that, no divorce, and how was this handled, and how much of it was kind of just accepted. Marriage becomes a critical moment, because that's when the Hindu family with the traditional scheme had to arrange a marriage, and they were supposed to go in the order of the age of the child. So if you have somebody midway, I mean, I often heard women say, well, I wasn't the most beautiful one in the family, but they had to marry me first. So what happens in that scheme, if you have somebody who's visibly disabled, there you have the mechanism of using the wealth of the family to try to maneuver that into a marriage, which is considered the normative stance. So it's these dynamics that intrigue me.
Good question.
So the first thing when you said many disabled people have felt, people take good care of them in many extended families. So this is a personal experience. So my uncle happens to have a severe intellectual disability, and my parents take care of him. But here, but there's also tragedy behind, in India doesn't have that sort of social justice measures, or rather the budget infrastructure to take care of persons with disabilities, and the fault is entirely that of the government, that they do not have good institutions, care homes like they have in Canada. So I don't think families have much choice, but also there are some families which leave their sibling or someone. I have personally witnessed that they leave their sibling in one of those institutions where there are like 100 beds and like maybe one toilet. It's in unsanitary conditions. So, my uncle is very lucky as well in that way. But I think this charity model, the fact that we have to be kind to this person with disability, is also this sort of good karma that I'm doing. Oh, this person needs my benevolence. I'm going to earn really good karma, attain moksha, or be really good in my next life. And the thing is, when it comes to marriage, I don't think many of these people will say yes to marrying this person who has whatever specific disability, because marriage is a very private question and a very important question. And I did quiz people the other way. What if your partner was disabled? Any person can today say, I cannot take care of a person with disability, because in India, the caregiving structures, there are no facilities. And the second question you asked, sorry, I forgot.
Maybe I did too.
We can take it up tomorrow.
Yeah.
So that, I'm sorry, we're gonna have to stop,
Yeah.
but this was a wonderful lecture and a great set of questions, and we'll tease this out tomorrow at coffee. So thank you very much. Those of you in the room and who are joining us on Zoom, stay tuned for next week, where the religious threads of Canada's colonial, 2 weeks from now, pardon me, because it's reading week next week. So don't come next week. Come 23rd for Neil Montgomery's. Okay, thanks everybody. See ya.